My hands were trembling at 37,000 feet. Not from the altitude, not from turbulence. The sky outside that aircraft window was perfectly still, a black expanse somewhere over the Atlantic, and the small reliquary case resting on the tray table in front of me was completely motionless. But my hands would not stop shaking. Because what I had seen in the 3 seconds before the cabin lights flickered and then returned to full brightness was something I have spent 9 years trying to find the precise words for. And the closest I've come is this. I saw a 15-year-old boy standing in the aisle, wearing jeans and a white t-shirt, looking directly at me, smiling. Not a dream, not a half-sleep vision. I was wide awake, reading the Divine Office, a cup of cold coffee on the armrest. He was there. And then, with the return of the lights, he was not. What I couldn't tell anyone on that flight, what I couldn't tell anyone for years, was that the boy looked exactly like the photograph in the folder I had been given before departure. A photograph of Carlo Acutis, a boy who had been dead for 16 years. But the vision wasn't the thing that destroyed my certainty about what is and isn't possible. The vision, as shattering as it was, I could have explained away. What I could not explain was what I found when I opened the reliquary case at Sao Paulo's Guarulhos airport, standing under fluorescent light at the customs inspection table. A discovery that had nothing to do with what I thought I was carrying, and everything to do with a sealed note I had been handed 7 years earlier, and told, in terms I didn't understand at the time, never to open until I arrived somewhere I hadn't yet been. That note had been in my breviary for 7 years. I need to tell you all three things in the right order. I need to show you how each of them fits together. Because if I tell you the vision without the context, it sounds like something a tired priest imagined on an overnight flight. And if I tell you about the reliquary without what came before it, you'll think the customs official made a mistake. But if I tell you everything, from the very first morning I encountered Carlo Acutis' name to what I read in that sealed note under the fluorescent light at Guarulhos, you will understand why I testified before the dicastery for the causes of saints in Rome, why my hands still shake when I hold certain objects, and why I have not been the same priest since the October night in 2006 when a 15-year-old boy in Monza pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm and said 4 words in Italian that I didn't fully understand until I was standing in Brazil. For 9 years, I kept this to myself. Today, I tell it all. My name is Father Dominic Riley. I'm Irish, ordained in 1988 by the Diocese of Galway, assigned to Rome in 1999 as part of the office coordinating liturgical materials across Vatican dicasteries, a role that sounds grander than it was. In practice, I was the priest who handled logistics, who couriered documents, who escorted relics, who sat in airports with liturgical objects in specially certified cases and made sure they arrived where they were meant to go. I have transported relics of 14 different saints across 22 countries. I know the canonical paperwork, the customs declarations, the temperature requirements, the specific lock configurations of the cases approved by the Vatican for secondary class relics. I am, if you want to be unkind about it, a bureaucrat in a collar. I tell you this because it matters. I am not a visionary. I am not a mystic. I am a methodical man with a preference for spreadsheets and a deep discomfort with anything that cannot be documented. My faith has always been solid, but intellectual, built on Aquinas, on the Fathers, on argument and structure. I did not grow up expecting to see things. I did not pray for private revelations. When people came to me with stories of miraculous experiences, I listened carefully and said nothing, which is its own kind of discipline. The morning I first heard the name Carlo Acutis, I was 38 days past my 51st birthday. It was the second week of October 2006. I was in Monza, in northern Italy, because the family of a young man who had just died requested a priest who spoke both Italian and English, and someone in the diocesan office in Rome passed along my name. The young man had died of leukemia. He was 15 years old. I arrived at San Gerardo Hospital on October 12th at approximately 9 in the evening. The corridor outside the room smelled of disinfectant and something else, something floral that I initially attributed to flowers brought by the family. There was a woman seated in the hall, dark-haired, composed in the particular way that grief can sometimes produce in people who have been preparing for a loss for weeks and have not yet had permission to fall apart. She introduced herself as Antonia Salzano. She thanked me for coming. She said her son had asked to see a priest before the end, had received the sacraments earlier that afternoon from the hospital chaplain, and had been, and here she paused, searching for the right word, very peaceful since. She said he had something he wanted to give me. Not the chaplain, a different priest. She had described the request to the diocesan office specifically, a priest who had worked with relics. I didn't know what that meant. I went in. Carlo Acutis was lying in the hospital bed, with his eyes open. He had an oxygen tube and 2 IV lines, and the monitors beside him were showing the slow, irregular trace of a heart under siege. He looked smaller than 15. His face was pale in the way that certain illnesses produce. Not gray, but drained of color in a way that made everything about him seem lit from inside by contrast. His eyes were dark and completely alert. He smiled when I came in. A real smile, full, unbothered by the room he was in. We talked for perhaps 12 minutes. I won't reproduce every word of that conversation. Some of it was sacramental in nature. Though, as I said, he had already received the sacraments from the chaplain, and what we discussed was not confession. He spoke about the Eucharist. He said, and I am translating from Italian, which he spoke with a slight English inflection, "Father, the Eucharist is my highway to heaven. I'm not afraid of the road." He said it lightly, the way a young man might talk about something he'd been thinking about for a long time and had finally settled in his mind. Then he reached under the thin blanket and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it out to me. I took it. It was a small rectangle, folded 3 times, sealed at the edge with a strip of tape. "Don't open it until you arrive," he said. I asked, "Arrive where?" He smiled again. "You'll know," he said. "When you're somewhere you haven't been yet, and you're holding something of mine, you'll know." I didn't understand. I thanked him. I put the folded paper in the inner pocket of my breviary, which I carry everywhere, and I said I would keep it safe. Carlo Acutis died on October 12th, 2006, at approximately 11 o'clock that night. He was 15 years old, 3 days short of his birthday. I still had no idea what I was carrying. In the weeks after Carlo died, I returned to Rome and resumed my ordinary work. The paper in my breviary sat undisturbed. I thought about it perhaps once a week at first, then less often as the months passed. It became one of those things a priest accumulates, a small, unexplained object, a deferred meaning, a private errand not yet completed. What I did not expect was that the name Carlo Acutis would begin appearing in my professional work approximately 8 months later. In June 2007, I received an internal memo from the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints, at that time still called the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, requesting that I assist with the preliminary documentation for a cause of canonization. The subject was Carlo Acutis of Monza, Italy, age at death, 15. The cause was being opened, informally, at the request of the Archdiocese of Milan, with the support of the boy's family. I read the file, all 11 pages of it, and on page 4, under the section titled Notable Characteristics of the Deceased, there was a detail that stopped me mid-sentence. Carlo Acutis had spent approximately 3 years, from 2004 to his death in 2006, building a website. He had documented it himself, coded it himself, organized and uploaded all the content himself. The website cataloged verified Eucharistic miracles from around the world. Not stories, not legends, cases that had passed through some form of ecclesiastical or scientific examination. By the time of his death, he had cataloged 156 separate cases, with photographs, locations, dates, and available scientific findings. He was 12 when he started. He was using the technical skills most people his age were applying to video games to build what would become one of the most cited devotional resources in contemporary Catholicism. This was the first time I grasped something about who Carlo Acutis actually was. And it was also the first moment, though I didn't register it consciously then, that something small and specific began pulling at the edge of my thinking. Because page 6 of the file contained a description of Carlo's approach to the Eucharist. Daily Mass, daily adoration, a documented habit of sitting in churches in the way some people sit near the sea. And on page 6, there was a line from his mother, Antonia Salzano, that I underlined with my pen. He said he wanted all the miracles he had documented to be turned into an exhibition that could travel the world, so that people could see the evidence with their own eyes. An exhibition that could travel, a physical thing that would move from place to place. I looked at that line and thought of the folded paper in my breviary. I didn't know why. There was nothing in the file that connected those two things. But my chest tightened in a way I couldn't immediately explain, and I turned the page quickly, the way you sometimes turn away from a thought you're not ready to have. That sensation, that tightening, that specific unreadiness, is the thing I kept returning to in the years that followed, because it was the 4th time I had felt exactly that, and each time, without exception, it had been pointing somewhere real. There was something in the file about the exhibition that didn't fit the timeline I was building in my head, but I didn't have the data yet to understand what was wrong. The verification of what happened that night began, formally, in the spring of 2009. The dicastery had moved the cause forward. As part of my logistical role, I was assigned to assist with the collection of depositions, the formal sworn testimonies required by the canonical process. I traveled to Monza, to Milan, to Assisi, and once to London, where Carlo had been born, to speak with people who had known him. Over a period of approximately 4 months, I sat in on 31 separate deposition sessions. I was not the principal investigator. My job was to organize the materials, confirm the chain of custody for documents, and, where necessary, translate between English and Italian. But over those 4 months, a pattern emerged in the testimony that I cannot describe in any other way, except to say that it did not fit the world I thought I was living in. The first indication came on the 11th day of deposition collection, in a small conference room in Monza. The witness was a woman who had been a teacher at the school Carlo attended. She was 54 years old, measured in her speech, the kind of person who qualifies every statement. She testified that Carlo had, on multiple occasions, told her specific things about specific people that he could not have known. Not general encouragements, specific things, the name of a relative, a medical detail, a date. She gave one example on the record. I will give you the numbers. In February of 2006, Carlo told her, in passing, in a school corridor, without preamble, that her sister in Bergamo would receive a diagnosis in September, that the diagnosis would initially appear serious, that it would be revised, and that by the following January, the sister would be completely fine. He said Bergamo, September, January. 3 coordinates. The teacher's sister was diagnosed with a pulmonary irregularity in Bergamo on September 14, 2006. The initial reading was classified as potentially malignant. A second reading on November 2, 2006, cleared the finding entirely. By January 2007, the sister had been formally discharged. I sat across from this woman and watched her describe this. Her hands were flat on the table. Her voice was absolutely steady. She had been carrying this for 3 years, she said, and had told no one except her sister, because she had no framework for what it meant. I noted the dates in my record. February 2006, prediction. September 14th, diagnosis. November 2nd, revised. January 2007, discharge. I cross-referenced the dates with the depositions we already had. They were consistent with every other piece of documentation in the case. I put down my pen. I picked it up again. Because the problem now was not whether the teacher was telling the truth. The problem was that if she was, and I believed she was, than the boy I had sat with for 12 minutes in October 2006, the boy who had handed me a sealed piece of paper and said, "You'll know when you're somewhere you haven't been," had the same capability. And I had been carrying whatever he gave me for 3 years. I excused myself after the session. I walked to a bathroom, ran cold water over my wrists, and looked at my own face in the mirror for about 45 seconds. Then I went back to work. But I want you to understand what had just shifted. I had managed, for 3 years, to keep the folded paper in a category I'd labeled unexplained pastoral gesture. Something a dying boy did because it gave him comfort, because it felt meaningful, because human beings make gestures at the end of their lives that are about love, not about specific information. I had protected that category carefully because the alternative was something my mind kept swerving away from. After the teacher's deposition, the category didn't hold anymore. If what you've just heard has stirred something in you, if you find yourself thinking about someone you love, someone you've been carrying in prayer, I want to offer you something before I go on. I've prepared a novena to Carlo Acutis, completely free, 9 days of prayer inspired by his devotion to the Eucharist and his trust in God's mercy. It's in the description, the first link, right below this video. Download it, pray it over these 9 days, and bring to it whoever weighs heaviest on your heart. But I have to go back now, because what I discovered the following week in Assisi changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about this case. The second deposition I need to tell you about happened in Assisi, in a small room off the main sacristy of the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. This was May 2009. The witness was a Franciscan brother who had been involved in early conversations about where Carlo's tomb would eventually be located, though that decision would not be finalized until years later. He was 61 years old, had been in religious life for 37 years, and was the specific kind of monk who seems to have converted skepticism itself into a spiritual practice. Every sentence he spoke came with its own built-in caveat. He testified to one thing that I am going to tell you precisely, because precision is the only way to do it justice. In the spring of 2006, approximately 5 months before Carlo's death, Carlo had visited Assisi with his family. The brother had met him briefly, informally, in the way you meet people who come through on pilgrimage. The meeting lasted perhaps 20 minutes, and during that conversation, without any context that the brother could identify, Carlo said the following: "This is where I want to stay. In this basilica, I want to stay close to St. Francis." The brother noted this as a pious sentiment, the kind a devout teenager might express, and thought nothing more of it. Carlo died in October 2006. In November 2007, after an extended period of discussion between the diocesan authorities, the Assisi Basilica, and the Acutis family, it was formally decided that Carlo's tomb would be located in the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Assisi. The announcement was made on November 14, 2007. The brother had been in Assisi for the decision, and he had remembered, with the clarity of a thing that has been waiting to be remembered, what Carlo said in spring of 2006. He had written it down the day after the decision was announced. He had the notebook with him at the deposition. I looked at the entry myself. November 15th, 2007. Carlo said, "In this basilica, I want to stay close to St. Francis." He told me, "I wrote it down because I needed it to exist somewhere outside my head." I understood that impulse completely. What I couldn't tell him, because my role in the process was professional, not personal, was that the boy had also said something to me in a hospital room in Monza in October 2006, and that I was sitting across from a monk in Assisi, one of the places connected to Carlo's eventual resting place, holding that information in my chest like a stone. The problem was expanding. Each verification was supposed to narrow the possibilities. Instead, each verification opened a new layer. The teacher's testimony with the Bergamo dates had suggested specific foreknowledge. The brother's testimony with the Assisi notebook suggested something about Carlo's relationship to place. And now I was sitting in the very place Carlo had named. Not at the tomb itself, the body wouldn't be transferred until 2019, but in the basilica he had pointed to, in a room off the sacristy. And the paper in my breviary was 12 inches from my right hand. I did not open it. I want to be honest about that, because people have asked me since. I did not open it because the instruction Carlo gave me had been precise. Not until you arrive somewhere you haven't been, holding something of mine. I was in Assisi, but I was not holding something of his. I was holding a piece of paper he had given me, which is different. And something, I cannot call it reason exactly, but something with the texture of reason, told me the instruction meant more than that. That intuition, as it turned out, would prove correct in a way that took me 7 more years to understand. The fourth open loop I haven't told you about yet is this. On the last day of the Assisi depositions, the Franciscan brother said something to me as I was packing up my materials, off the record, after the session was formally closed. He said, "Father, I don't know why I'm telling you this, but I have a feeling your connection to this cause is not finished. I think you'll be sent somewhere with something belonging to Carlo, and when that happens, pay close attention to what you see." I thanked him. I assumed he meant it spiritually. I filed it in the same category as the folded paper, deferred meaning. That filing system was about to collapse completely. The investigation into Carlo Acutis' life produced, over the years between 2009 and 2019, a body of documentation that I believe is unlike anything I encountered in my 35 years of work for the Vatican. The precision was the thing, not the volume. Canonization causes produce enormous volumes of material. The precision was unusual. Every claim the witnesses made could be anchored to a date, a place, a name, a medical record, a school register, a website timestamp. Carlo had been, among other things, a teenager who understood documentation. He had coded a database of Eucharistic miracles in his bedroom, organized by country, by century, by scientific finding. He understood that evidence mattered, that specific data matters, that "I felt something" is a different kind of statement than on September 14th, the test showed this result. I have thought many times since about the particular irony of this. The first millennial saint, because that is what the church would eventually call him, left behind the most meticulously organized evidence trail of any saint I am aware of, and he left it on the internet, where it has been accumulating views ever since. In 2019, Carlo's body was exhumed from its original resting place in Assago and transferred to the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Assisi. The formal exhumation and examination took place in January of that year. I was part of the small clerical team present for the transfer. The examination by the appointed medical consultant, a physician whose report runs to 47 pages, found the body in a condition described formally as substantially integral. The tissue, in certain areas, showed preservation inconsistent with the 13 years of interment under normal conditions. The report notes that the anomalous preservation was concentrated in the area of the thorax, specifically, the heart. I was present when the physician presented his preliminary findings. The room was cold. It was a January morning in Assisi, 6:45 a.m., thin light coming through a single high window. The physician used the phrase, "preservation inconsistent with expected post-mortem progression given the documented conditions of internment." He gave the temperature of the site as measured over the 13-year period, an average of 14.3 degrees Celsius, seasonal variation between 8.1 and 19.7. At those temperatures, under those conditions, the standard Henske nomogram, the forensic model for post-mortem progression, would predict a specific degree of tissue deterioration, which I will not describe in clinical terms because it is not necessary. What matters is the number. The physician's assessment placed the actual state of preservation at a point on the Henske scale that would be expected after approximately 3 to 4 years, not 13. The difference was 9 years of tissue progression that had not occurred. I wrote that number in my notebook. 9. The number sat there on the page. I looked at it for a long time. Because the problem, again, was not the finding itself. It was that the finding was anchored to a specific measurement. 14.3 degrees, average temperature. 8.1 to 19.7 range, 3 to 4 years expected state, 13 years actual time. The numbers didn't argue with each other. They simply didn't produce a result that the model could explain. And when the model fails with verified inputs, what you have is an impossibility in the technical sense, a result outside the predicted range that the measurement methodology cannot account for. I knew that formula. I had seen it applied to relics before, but not with measurements this specific and not with a discrepancy this large. That night, alone in the small guest room the basilica had provided, I took my breviary out of my bag. I felt the small rectangle of the folded paper in the inner pocket. It had been there for 12 years. I pressed it between my thumb and index finger without opening it. The paper was still firm, the tape still sealed. I had no physical reason to think it would say anything useful, and yet my hands, at 37,000 feet somewhere over the Atlantic 5 years later, would feel exactly this same sensation. The weight of something specific, the resistance of sealed tape, the question underneath. I put the breviary back in my bag. What I couldn't imagine then was that the most important part of this story hadn't started yet. In 2021, I received a call from an office in the dicastery that I had not dealt with directly before, the section handling relic certifications and physical objects associated with causes of canonization. The caller explained that a request had come through proper canonical channels from a diocese in Brazil, Sao Paulo, in connection with a planned exhibition of documentation relating to Carlo Acutis' life and the Eucharistic Miracles website. A second-class relic of Carlo, a piece of fabric from the garment worn at burial, had been certified by the proper authority. The request was for a priest to serve as courier and accompanying guardian for the relic's transport from Rome to Sao Paulo. My name had been put forward, not randomly. My documented experience with relic transport across multiple jurisdictions, my Italian and English fluency, and I want to be precise about this because it matters. The fact that I had been present at the exhumation in 2019 and had signed certain documents of canonical continuity relating to the physical remains. There was a chain of custody consideration. I accepted. I want to be careful here about the timeline, because I know how this next detail sounds, and I need you to have the facts in the right order. When I accepted the assignment in early 2021, the relic being transported was described as a second-class relic, a piece of fabric, standard certification. I had transported second-class relics 17 times previously. The paperwork was familiar, the case specifications were standard, the customs declarations were the same form I had filed in 7 different languages. What changed, and this change was communicated to me in writing in a formal document from the dicastery approximately 3 weeks before departure, was the nature of the relic. Due to the findings from the 2019 exhumation, specifically the documented anomaly in preservation centered on the thoracic region, and following a formal request from the Acutis family, coordinated through the Archdiocese of Milan, the decision had been made to include a first-class relic in the transport. A first-class relic is a piece of the saint's actual body. The specific relic designated was a fragment of tissue from the heart of Carlo Acutis. I read that document 3 times. Then I sat at my desk in Rome for approximately 20 minutes without moving. Because a fragment of tissue from the heart of Carlo Acutis was a piece of the specific organ that the physician's examination had identified as the center of the preservation anomaly, the tissue that had not progressed as the Henschke model predicted, the tissue that sat 9 years outside the expected range. A piece of that tissue was going to Sao Paulo, Brazil, and I was going to carry it on a commercial aircraft overnight across the Atlantic and hand it to the diocese at Guarulhos Airport. And I was going to be holding something belonging to Carlo. The phrase landed with the weight of a thing that has been waiting 8 years to make contact. When you're somewhere you haven't been yet, and you're holding something of mine, you'll know. I had never been to Brazil. If you downloaded the novena I mentioned earlier, you already know the feeling I'm trying to describe. That sense of a prayer being answered not with an answer, but with a presence. If you haven't yet, It's still there, the first link in the description below this video. Pray it for whoever you've been carrying. And if these stories mean something to you, this is the channel where I keep gathering them. But what happened on the flight to Brazil, what I saw, and then what I found at the airport, changed even the way I pray, changed the shape of the thing I call faith. And I haven't been able to tell it simply, until now. I flew from Rome Fiumicino on a Tuesday evening in March of 2022. The flight was a 12-hour overnight to Guarulhos, operated by a Brazilian carrier. I had a window seat in a middle section of economy, which I had specifically requested so that I could keep the certified case under the seat in front of me at all times, rather than in the overhead compartment. The case itself was a sealed reliquary container, approximately the dimensions of a hardback book, with 2 independent locking mechanisms and a tamper-evident seal. Inside, in a temperature-controlled inner compartment, was the certified reliquary holding the fragment of heart tissue. Temperature inside the case held it between 18 and 22 degrees Celsius by a passive regulation system certified by the Vatican Technical Office. I had the calibration certificate in my travel documents. Test date February 28, 2022. Reference number CR20220047. Verified range 18.4 to 21.8 degrees Celsius over 72 hours of passive operation. Certified operational duration 96 hours from seal activation, which had occurred at 12 noon the day before departure, giving me a safety margin of 36 hours beyond the flight. I know these numbers because I checked them 4 times before boarding. I am a methodical man. I check things. The flight departed at 21:30 hours. I settled into my seat, said evening prayer, drank approximately half a cup of coffee that tasted of aluminum, and opened my breviary to the Office of Readings. The breviary, as always, contained the folded paper in the inner pocket. I felt its presence the way you feel a word that is forming in your mouth before you've decided to say it. The cabin lights were dimmed at approximately 2300 hours. Most passengers around me were asleep or watching films with headphones. I was reading. At approximately 2:47 in the morning, I know the time because I glanced at my watch directly before it happened, for no particular reason, the way you sometimes check a clock without needing the information. The cabin lights flickered. 2 seconds of dimness, then full brightness again. In those 2 seconds, in the aisle to my right, approximately 1.5 meters away, I saw a boy standing. Jeans, white t-shirt, dark hair, slightly disheveled in the way of a teenager who doesn't think much about his hair. 15 years old, or close to it, and he was looking directly at me with an expression I can only describe as recognition. The expression of someone who sees a person they were expecting to see. He was smiling. He was exactly as he appeared in the photograph I had been given in the briefing materials before departure. The photograph taken approximately 2 years before his death. Carlo Acutis. I did not cry out. I did not move. My heart rate in the next 40 seconds was extremely high. I could feel it in my temples, in my wrists, but I did not move. I looked at the place where he had been, and what was there was the aisle of an aircraft, a meal cart parked 3 rows ahead, the dark oval windows. Nothing else. I put my hand on the certified case under the seat in front of me. The case was solid. The tamper-evident seal was intact. I checked my watch. 2:48 a.m. I wrote in the margin of my breviary, 2:48, Carlo, aisle, white shirt, smiling. I wrote it immediately so that I could not later convince myself I had been asleep. I was not asleep. I sat with this for the remaining 7 hours of the flight. I prayed. I did not sleep. At one point, perhaps an hour later, I reached into the inner pocket of the breviary and touched the folded paper with the pad of my index finger. The tape was still sealed. I withdrew my hand. I had never been to Brazil. I was holding something of his. I thought about the words Carlo had said in October 2006. Not if I arrived somewhere I hadn't been. When. He had used the future indicative, not the conditional. When you're holding something of mine. As a statement of certainty, not possibility. 15-year-old boys dying of leukemia do not typically speak in the future indicative about events they cannot know will occur, unless they know something about the future that the rest of us don't. We landed at Guarulhos at approximately 6:15 in the morning, local time, March 2022 in Sao Paulo, a warm, gray dawn, the kind of sky that looks like damp concrete. I cleared passport control without difficulty, collected my single checked bag, and proceeded to the customs inspection area for declared items, which is where couriers with certified ecclesiastical objects report separately from general passenger flow. The inspection table was a long steel counter under fluorescent lighting. The customs official, a man in his 40s, professional, thorough, asked me to open the case for visual inspection of the contents. This is standard. I was prepared for it. I had the canonical documentation, the Vatican certification, the chain of custody form, the specific permit from the Brazilian Ecclesiastical Authority, and the customs pre-authorization reference number, ANAC EC20220391. I placed the case on the steel counter. I entered the combination for the first lock. Confirmed. Second lock. Confirmed. I broke the tamper-evident seal, which requires a scissors cut across a specific adhesive strip, and opened the case. The inner reliquary was in its foam cradle, a small container, approximately 8 centimeters in diameter, sealed with its own wax impression. The wax impression was intact. The temperature indicator strip on the inner compartment read green, within range, 19.3 degrees Celsius. I lifted the inner reliquary carefully. The customs official examined the external documentation attached to it. He asked a clarifying question about the nature of the relic and the receiving authority. I answered. He nodded, made a notation. And then he said, "Father, there seems to be something additional inside the outer case." I looked down at the open case. In the foam cradle, where the inner reliquary had been resting, there was a small flat object that I had not placed there. It was approximately the size of a playing card, slightly thicker, cream-colored. It appeared to be a folded piece of cardstock or heavy paper. I did not touch it for approximately 4 seconds. I looked at the customs official. He shrugged slightly, indicating he was waiting. I reached into the case and lifted the object out. It was a folded piece of heavy cream paper, sealed with tape. The fold was identical. 3 folds, the same dimensions, the same strip of tape, to the paper Carlo Acutis had pressed into my hand in October 2006. Identical in every physical characteristic I could measure with my eyes and hands. The customs official was watching. This was not the moment to stand at a steel counter and try to process the metaphysical implications of what I was holding. I managed to say, in Portuguese that I hope was approximately coherent, that the object was a devotional document associated with the relic, which is a canonical category that exists, and which the officer seemed to accept. He made a further notation, closed the inspection, and stamped the forms. I walked to a row of seats against the wall of the arrivals hall. I sat down. I had 2 papers. The one from the breviary, which Carlo had given me in the hospital in October 2006, still sealed. And this one, from inside the certified reliquary case, which had been sealed by the Vatican Technical Office, and whose contents I could swear under oath had been examined by me before sealing in Rome. I had been inside that case. There had been nothing except the inner reliquary and the foam cradle. My hands were shaking. I opened the breviary first, and I took out the paper from 2006, the one Carlo had given me 16 years before. I broke the tape along the edge, unfolded it 3 times, and read what was written. It was handwritten in Italian, in the slightly irregular script of a teenager. It said, "Padre, quando sei arrivato, hai quello che ti serve. Guarda dentro la cosa che hai portato. Troverai la conferma. San Paolo. Marzo. La mia anima è con il Signore." Father, when you've arrived, you have what you need. Look inside the thing you carried. You will find the confirmation. Sao Paulo, March. My soul is with the Lord. Sao Paulo, March. He wrote that in October 2006. He was 15 years old. He had 3 weeks to live. He had never, to my knowledge, been told anything about the exhibition in Brazil, which would not be planned for another 15 years. The Eucharistic Miracles exhibition that would eventually come to Sao Paulo was not organized until 2021. The decision to transport a first-class relic was not made until 2021. The specific month of March was not determined until late 2021. And a dying boy in Monza in 2006 had written, Sao Paulo, March. I sat in the arrivals hall at Guarulhos Airport for 22 minutes before I was able to stand. I know it was 22 minutes because I watched the clock on the wall across from me, a round analog clock above the sliding doors, and I counted the minutes partly because it was the only concrete thing available to me. Then I opened the second paper, the one from inside the reliquary case. It was shorter, 3 lines in the same handwriting. Asterisk, L'Eucaristia è l'autostrada per il cielo. Porta la mia storia ovunque sei mandato. Avrai visto cosa vuol dire essere amato da Dio. Asterisk, the Eucharist is the highway to heaven. Carry my story wherever you are sent. By now you will have seen what it means to be loved by God. I put both papers on my knee. I covered my face with my hands. I am 67 years old, and I have been a priest for 37 years, and I wept in an airport arrivals hall in Sao Paulo, Brazil, for approximately 4 minutes, which is longer than I have wept at any single moment in my adult life, including the death of my own mother. Then I folded both papers carefully. I placed them side by side in the inner pocket of my breviary, and I called the contact number for the Sao Paulo diocesan office to confirm my arrival. I have told this story a small number of times in the years since that morning. Twice to church officials, formally, in documented sessions. Once to Antonia Salzano, Carlo's mother, in a meeting at her home in Milan in the autumn of 2022. A meeting that lasted 3.5 hours, at the end of which she told me that Carlo had spoken of a priest with a briefcase, a priest who carried things, and that he had said this priest would eventually understand. She did not know what he meant at the time. She wrote it in her journal in November 2006, the month after his death. She showed me the entry. Date, November 8th, 2006. Carlo spoke of a priest who carries things. He said this priest would understand, eventually. I said, eventually is a generous word for 16 years. She laughed. It was the first time either of us had laughed in that conversation. She also told me something I hadn't known before. When Carlo was building the Eucharistic Miracles website in 2004, 2005, the year before his death, he had included in his personal notes a wish that the exhibition of the cases would travel physically, that people in Brazil, in Africa, in Asia would be able to see the evidence with their own eyes, not just on a screen. He had a particular feeling, she said, about Brazil, about a city called Sao Paulo. He had mentioned it to her twice. She had assumed it was because Brazil has a large Catholic population, because the numbers for Catholic practice in Brazil are significant. But he had been specific about Sao Paulo, not Rio de Janeiro, not Brasilia, Sao Paulo. I asked her, did he ever mention a month? She thought for a moment. Then she said, he mentioned March once. She didn't remember the context. She thought it had been in early 2006. March, Sao Paulo, a priest who carries things. I have those words written in my notebook, on the same page as the numbers from Assisi. 9 years of tissue progression that did not occur. I look at both pages sometimes, and I try to find the gap between them, the logical gap, the evidential gap, the place where a reasonable person can stand and say, this is coincidence, this is pattern seeking, this is grief constructing meaning. I've tried. I spent a significant part of my academic training learning how to find those gaps, because finding gaps is what rigorous thought requires. I cannot find the gap. After returning from Brazil in March 2022, I spent 4 months writing a formal account of everything I have just told you, from the hospital room in 2006 to the arrivals hall at Guarulhos. The document is 114 pages. It includes copies of both papers, certified by a notary. It includes the chain of custody documentation for the reliquary case, with the reference number ANAC-EC2022039101. It includes the temperature log from the case's passive regulation system, showing no interruption and no unauthorized access, which means, technically, the second paper should not exist inside a sealed case. It includes the customs inspection form from March 2022 with the official notation. It includes a copy of Antonia Salzano's journal entry from November 8, 2006. I submitted this document to the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints in July 2022. I testified formally in October of that year, 2 sessions, each approximately 4 hours. The canonical assessors asked me many of the questions you might imagine. Had I placed the second paper in the case myself and forgotten? No. Could someone else have accessed the case during transit? The tamper evidence seal was intact. Could the paper have been placed before I sealed the case in Rome? I examined the inside of the case myself before sealing. Could the paper have been there and I failed to see it? The inner compartment holds the reliquary and nothing else. The foam cradle is form-fitted. The assessors noted everything. They did not offer a conclusion. That is not their role in testimony collection. Their role is to record, to verify, to cross-reference with the other documentation in the cause. That process continues. What I can tell you is this. On October 10th, 2020, Carlo Acutis was beatified by Pope Francis in Assisi. The ceremony took place in front of the basilica Carlo had named, in the town he had said he wanted to stay in, close to St. Francis. I was present. I stood in the crowd, in the October sun, with my breviary under my arm, and I watched Pope Francis speak the words of beatification over the image of a 15-year-old boy in jeans. The image chosen for the occasion shows Carlo the way he looked every day, young, dark-haired, ordinary. The caption read, in several languages, God's influencer. That phrase, God's influencer, struck me as simultaneously the most internet-era description I had ever heard applied to a saint, and the most precisely accurate, because that is exactly what he was. A young person who had understood, before almost anyone in the church understood it clearly, that the modern world receives information through the same channels it uses for everything else, and that if you want to show people the evidence of something, you put it where they already are. He put it on the internet. He cataloged 156 cases of Eucharistic miracles, 162 by the time the cause was fully examined, with photographs, dates, locations, and scientific findings, and he made it available to anyone who wanted to look. He was 12 when he started. He was the first millennial saint, and he was the patron of the internet before anyone called him that, because the internet was where he had done his most important work while he was alive. On September 7th, 2025, and I am writing this having lived through this day, Pope Leo XIV canonized Carlo Acutis during the Jubilee celebrations in Rome. The ceremony was held in St. Peter's Square. The square was full. I was there, seated in a section reserved for clergy who had participated formally in the canonical process. When the moment of canonization came, when the words were spoken that declare a person definitively in the presence of God, a declaration made by the Church with the full weight of her authority, I reached into my inner breast pocket, where I keep my breviary, and I pressed my thumb against the folded papers. They were still there, both of them. And I thought about a boy in a hospital bed in October 2006, with an oxygen tube and 2 IV lines, and a completely unhurried smile, handing a piece of paper to a priest he had never met before, and saying, "You'll know when you're somewhere you haven't been, holding something of mine." He was 15 years old. He had 3 weeks to live, and he knew. I want to tell you about one more moment, because it happened recently, and because it completes something I've been circling around for most of this account. In February of 2025, 3 months before the canonization, I was asked to give a talk at a parish in Philadelphia, a large parish, mostly Irish American, the kind of community I feel at home in. The talk was about Carlo Acutis, specifically about the Eucharistic Miracles website and its significance for contemporary Catholic practice. I had given similar talks before. This was part of what my life had become since 2022, since the formal testimony, since word had moved quietly through certain circles that I had a particular connection to this story. After the talk, a woman came up to me at the edge of the hall. She was perhaps 60 years old, careful in her dress, the kind of face that has seen something and doesn't quite know where to put it. She waited until the other people had finished their questions, and then she said, "Father, my son has been very ill. He received a blessing using one of the printed cards from Carlo's exhibition, the one that came through here last year. And 3 days later, his oncologist called to say the scan results were different from what they'd expected. I don't know what to make of it. I don't know if I'm allowed to make anything of it." I stood with this woman for about 15 minutes. I told her what I tell everyone who comes to me with something that sits in the space between what they can explain and what they cannot. That the church moves slowly and carefully with these things, and that moving carefully is not the same as dismissing. That keeping the experience alive, writing it down, praying about it, reporting it through proper channels, is an act of honesty, not credulity. That the evidence matters, that Carlo, of all people, would have wanted the evidence. She nodded. She said, "He was the patron of the internet. He would have wanted a good database." I laughed. I said, "Yes, exactly." She asked me if I thought her son was going to be all right. I thought of a hospital room in Monza. I thought of a completely unhurried smile. I thought of the words, "My soul is with the Lord." I said, "I think he's being held, and I think you should pray. And I think you should document everything your doctors tell you, because documentation is its own form of prayer when it comes to Carlo Acutis." She took my hand in both of hers for a moment, the way people do when they have nothing more to say but aren't ready to leave. Then she went. I sat down in an empty chair at the edge of the hall. Outside the windows, Philadelphia in February. Gray, cold, the streetlights just coming on. Inside, the folding chairs being stacked, the residue of coffee, the ordinary end of an ordinary evening in a parish hall in a city I had never been to before. I was somewhere I hadn't been. I reached into my breast pocket. My breviary was there, with the 2 folded papers. The papers were always there. I had not unfolded them again since the airport in Sao Paulo. I didn't need to. I had memorized every word. The Eucharist is the highway to heaven. Carry my story wherever you are sent. I have been carrying it now for 19 years, and I am not done. There are things I know for certain now that I could not have said with certainty in October 2006. Carlo Acutis was beatified. He was canonized. His body, examined under documented conditions with verified measurements, showed preservation centered in the heart that deviated from the predicted post-mortem progression by 9 years on the Hensj scale. The first miracle attributed to his intercession involved Matthias, a Brazilian boy from Campo Grande, healed of a pancreatic condition in 2013 in a case examined and verified through the standard canonical process. The second miracle, verified for the canonization, involved Valeria Valverde of Costa Rica, a young woman with a traumatic brain injury, examined in 2022. Both miracles verified by physicians whose findings were submitted to the dicastery and examined by independent consultants. The exhibition of Eucharistic miracles that Carlo built, the one he dreamed about as a 12-year-old in his bedroom in Milan, the one he described to his mother as something that would travel, that would go to Brazil, to Sao Paulo in March, has visited more than 15 countries. It has been viewed by millions of people. It arrives in each location with a certified relic and a team of volunteers, and the complete documentation of 162 cases, in which the Eucharist, under examination, produced results that the available science cannot fully account for. He was 15 years old when he died. He was 33 years old in the counting of Catholic years when he was canonized. 33 because that is the age of Christ at the crucifixion, and the Church has a tradition of canonizing saints at that symbolic age of spiritual maturity, regardless of when they died. He has been called the patron saint of the internet because that is what he was before anyone gave it a title. He has been called the first millennial saint because the facts support it. Born 1991, died 2006, canonized 2025. He has been called God's influencer because he understood, at 12 years old, that the most powerful form of witness in the modern world is documentation freely shared, available to anyone who wants to look. He was also the boy who pressed a folded piece of paper into a tired Irish bureaucrat's hand in a hospital in Monza and said with complete unhurried certainty, "You'll know when you arrive." He was right. He was right about Sao Paulo, and about March, and about the priest who carries things. He was right about staying close to St. Francis, and about the Basilica in Assisi, and about the woman in Bergamo being completely fine by January. He was right, apparently, about the nature of his own departure. "My soul is with the Lord," written by a boy who had 3 weeks to live, and who seemed to know it not as tragedy, but as information. I am 67 years old. I have been a priest for 37 years. I have transported relics across 22 countries. I have attended the beatification and the canonization of a boy I sat with for 12 minutes in a hospital room. And what I believe now, what I cannot disbelieve, because the evidence is specific and the numbers are real and the papers are in my breviary, is that Carlo Acutis was not merely a devout teenager who happened to be good at computers. He was someone whose relationship with the divine had reached a clarity that most of us spend our entire lives approaching without arriving. He saw clearly. He spoke precisely. He left evidence because he understood that evidence is what holds a story in place after the person is gone. The traces are everywhere. You only have to know how to look. If this testimony has marked you, if it has pressed against something you've been carrying, I ask one thing of you. Subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. On this channel, we keep gathering the traces Carlo left all over the world. The witnesses, the numbers, the folded papers that turn up in places they shouldn't be. And if you want to carry something of this story with you into the next 9 days, the free novena to Carlo Acutis is in the description, the first link, right below this video. Download it, pray it, share it. Bring to it whoever weighs heaviest on your heart. Carlo said the Eucharist was his highway to heaven. He was 15 years old, and he wasn't afraid of the road. The traces of heaven are everywhere. You only have to know how to look.